Hi, and welcome to Conversations in the West. My name is Steve Capper. I'm the Executive Director of Bold Visions Conservation. With me today is Wesley Leonard, who is the new Chairman of the Board of Bold Visions Conservation, and for 6 years was the Chairman of the Board of the New Mexico Wilderness Alliance. Welcome, Wes.
Thanks, Steve. I'm happy to be here.
It's great to have you. What I'd like to do for people is to give them a sense of your history and your connection to the West, and what really got you involved in conservation work.
I grew up in the 1950s in Georgia. I always had access to the outdoors. There was plenty of wild lands in Georgia back then. But later on, I had to move to Connecticut for a job opportunity. In Connecticut, I started realizing that I did not have the kind of opportunities that I was used to get out into the land and interact with wildlife and just be a part of nature. Fortunately, one of my brothers got a job teaching at the University of Texas at El Paso. And I started coming out to the West back in the late 60s. And I immediately fell in love with the place. And I knew I wanted to be here. And my brother and I, on my visits, we would start roaming to various places. We'd go to the Gila, we'd go to northern New Mexico, we'd go to the Guadalupe Mountains and Big Bend in Texas. And I knew that I wanted to be out here and that I wanted to be a part of the effort to preserve these wonderful lands.
Now, Wes, you have a special connection to the Gila. Why don't you give people a perspective about the amount of time you've spent in the wilds of the Gila country?
Oh, I started hiking in the Gila back in about 1972. I was hanging out with a guy named Dave Foreman, who at that time was living in an adobe shack in Glenwood. And I would go up there and we would start hiking various places in the Gila. And I guess over the past almost 40 years, I've hiked virtually every trail and a lot of places that don't have trails throughout the Gila wilderness and the Aldo Leopold wilderness and surrounding lands.
During some of this time, and I know in some of your earlier history with conservation, there were moments where oil and gas development threatened some special lands in the West. Do you have any real memories of any fights or disagreements with oil and gas companies during this time?
Well, I remember one time, and this was in 1980, Yates Petroleum of Artesia decided that they were going to drill in a wilderness area in southeastern New Mexico under the guise that they had subsurface rights and that the agency, in this case Fish and Wildlife, did not have the lawful authority to prevent them from doing that. So myself and 2 or 3 other guys from New Mexico and from El Paso, we rode over there as fast as we could, and we blocked the access road that they had bulldozed into the wildlife refuge. So that was one example. Also did a lot of work on trying to prevent oil and gas drilling just north of Guadalupe Mountains National Park. And in both cases, we were pretty successful.
That's fantastic. Wes, you've been involved in conservation for a long time. What would you say has changed? You know, I know we've talked a number of times about what it was like, you know, maybe in the 70s and 80s with the Sierra Club. Kind of give people a perspective of what that work was like and the camaraderie.
Yeah. Well, within 6 months of moving to El Paso, I became the chairman of the El Paso Regional Group of the Sierra Club. And it was completely driven by volunteers. There were no professional staff. Nobody was paid. We would work our 40 or 50 hours a week at our jobs. And then on the weekends and at night, we would do our conservation work. I can remember many times driving through the night to attend some hearing in some teeny tiny town somewhere in New Mexico or West Texas. And there was camaraderie, and there was great fun, and we supported one another. Unfortunately, as time has passed, the people who want to despoil the land have become more and more sophisticated. They've gotten more and more funding, and it's become necessary now to have professionals work on the conservation side because volunteers simply don't have the time or the horsepower to make the difference that we need to make now. And that's why organizations like Bold Vision Conservation is very, very important.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, you had 6 years at the helm of the New Mexico Wilderness Alliance. At that
I
time,
was a founder.
You were a founder.
Board member for 13 years.
Give people a little sense of what that was like, the whole experience of founding the group and then moving forward with it.
Well, it was very exciting. We started out essentially with nothing, but we did have a really great group of committed volunteers. And as time passed, we realized if we were going to make a lot of progress, we did have to move beyond an all-volunteer organization and hire professional staff. At that time, our primary focus was on BLM wilderness in New Mexico. And one of the first things we did was try to re-inventory all the wild BLM land for their wilderness characteristics. And then as time passed, and we got more funding, we were able to add additional staff while still having a committed group of volunteers. I think one of the most important early campaigns, and it remains important today, is the effort to preserve Otero Mesa. I think that is a success story in that had not we intervened, the place would be covered with oil and gas rigs right now.
Yeah.
But
well,
really, thanks to the effort of Steve Capper here and a number of other people, the place is still pristine.
Yeah, it holds a lot of special value to me. Talk for a minute about another area of significance, and that's the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks, which we know is in line to potentially become a national monument. And unlike a lot of people, you really have a history in that area.
I do have a history. Shortly after I moved to El Paso, I got a job with the Las Cruces office of the BLM. This was back about 1976. In 1976, FLPMA, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, was passed, which gave BLM its first mandate to inventory all of its lands for wilderness characteristics. I was fortunate enough to be hired to do a part of that inventory, and my inventory covered places like the Organ Mountains, like the West Potrillo Mountains, the Robledos, the Las Uvas. All of these are included in wilderness and national monument proposals that are pending right now.
You know, one of the things and one of the groups that we have to fight so often when we're trying to create wilderness is people in the livestock industry. And they continue to say again and again that our efforts at wilderness and national monuments are going to put them out of business. In fact, there's legislation now that would double the amount of time grazing leases are good for. They've also been a pretty vocal critic of getting wolves back in the wild. What does Wes Leonard have to say about some of these stockmen that have been out there over the years and their efforts at fighting wilderness?
That's a very good question, Steve. And there's really no easy answer. But I do want to point out that, again, starting back as early as 1970, various organizations that I was involved with started making a concerted effort to establish positive relationships with those in the livestock industry. We actually went out and lived on their ranches, we worked with them, we were a part of their culture. And we tried to convince them that in reality, conservation is a rancher's best friend. You know, without the lands, without the public lands, they would have a very difficult time surviving. But radical elements took over. And from an ideological standpoint, people in the livestock industry and ranching became rabid opponents of anything that seems to have to do with leaving some of the land in a natural state. They are vehemently against wolf reintroduction. Unlike every other business in this country, they expect the government to protect them and to give them an edge that no other business has. And I think now any possibility of having a meaningful dialogue with ranchers is pretty much beyond the pale.
Now, Wes, as we've been starting Bold Visions, and you and I have spent a lot of time talking and visualizing the future. I know some people have said there's really not any need for another conservation group. And given your history, because you've been with a lot of winning organizations over time, what made you decide to get engaged in Bold Visions?
Well, what I like about Bold Vision, and I think where we have a particular niche, is that while our focus is on preserving and protecting and restoring wild lands and wildlife, we understand that we can't look at those issues in a vacuum, because everything in the larger world impacts on our ability to do that. Population, for example, is perhaps the greatest threat. Fossil fuels, creating global warming, the pollution of our air and waters. All of these issues are directly related and have a significant impact on the natural world. And Bold Visions is enlarging our scope beyond the average conservation organization to look at our issues in the context of these larger mega trends.
One of the things we're going to be doing at Bold Visions is taking perhaps what we'd say is a more critical look at our elected officials. One of the concerns that I know I've had and you've shared with me is the fact that protecting lands, protecting wolves, seems to be taking an inordinate amount of time. What do you think of what's happened in politics in recent years?
Well, I think that there's a very dramatic lack of leadership. If you look back in other times, you look at members of Congress and presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, Clinton P. Anderson, people like that, it was a priority. They understood the importance of the natural world. They understood that the natural world is the crucible in which life as we know it was developed. And if life as we know it is going to continue, it's going to be because we have preserved some of the natural areas where DNA can continue to exist and evolve, and it's not going to come from computing, things like that. Unfortunately, most politicians are focused only on what's in front of them and what's it going to take to get them elected. And I think at Bold Vision, we're going to have to be a part of the effort to re-educate our political leaders on how important issues of wilderness and wildlife and natural lands and air and water is.
Wes, I want to thank you for being here today. It's been a great conversation. I just want to finish up with maybe you just telling people a little bit about one of your favorite hiking spots, where you like to go, and what makes being there so special.
Oh, there's so many. That's probably the hardest question that you could possibly ask me. I think my favorite hiking place is the next hike that I'm going to do. And my next hike is going to be in Utah. My previous hike was Big Bend about a week ago. That was my favorite place then. Next week I'm going to be in Utah. That's going to be my favorite place.
Wes, thank you very much for being here. And we look forward to another conversation in the West in the near future.
Thank you, Steve.